8th grade history, Chapter 2, The First English Colonies. Section 1, The English Begin to Explore and Colonize. England's spiritual and political heritage. England did not begin the difficult task of colonizing the North American wilderness until 1585, decades after the French and Spanish came to the New World. The English came to America in God's perfect timing, for by then an important change had taken place in England. It had become a Protestant country in which the Bible was freely available to all. The seeds of the English Reformation had been planted as early as the 1300s when John Wycliffe exposed false doctrines of the Roman Church and had the entire Bible translated into English for the first time. In the 1500s, an English translation of the New Testament by William Tyndale circulated widely in Britain. In the 1530s, Henry VIII made the English Reformation official by breaking all ties between England and the Roman Church. Although Henry made his move for personal reasons, the English people were ready for a genuine Protestant Reformation. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the English people had access to the Bible in their own language as never before. People thronged to the churches from miles around to hear the scriptures read aloud. Thus, the English people had a strong spiritual heritage. England also had an admirable political heritage. Since Anglo-Saxon times, English rulers and their subjects had been developing a form of limited representative government under the rule of law. In the year 1215, King John signed the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which helped prepare England for limited government. The British Parliament also began to develop in the 1200s, paving the way for more representative government. Under the wise rule of Elizabeth I, England enjoyed stable government and relative prosperity. The English people continued their long and growing respect for political freedom. The Bible had an important influence on the men and women who came to America and on the kind of government they set up. All the ideas about morality, justice, individual responsibility, and freedom that have made our country great came from the Bible. If the French or Spanish had been the dominant settlers in North America, our country would have had a very different history. The people of France and Spain did not have access to the Bible as the people of England did. But, in God's providence, England led in the colonization of North America. Early English explorers. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus discovered America, an Italian navigator named John Cabot explored the Atlantic coast of North America and claimed the land for England. Cabot was the first modern European explorer to set foot on the mainland of North America. For nearly a century, England did little to strengthen its claim in the New World. Toward the end of the 16th century, the English began to show interest in North America once again. In 1576, Queen Elizabeth sent Sir Martin Frobisher in search of the Northwest Passage, the supposed water route through North America to the Pacific. In 1577, Francis Drake embarked on a daring voyage that made him the first Englishman to sail around the world. In his ship, the Golden Hind, he crossed the Atlantic and passed through the Strait of Magellan. He then sailed up the Pacific coast of South America, boldly raiding Spanish ships and settlements along the way. After exploring the Pacific coast of North America, he sailed across the Pacific and Indian Oceans around Africa and back to England. When he finally arrived in 1580, Queen Elizabeth met him at the dock and knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Roanoke, the Lost Colony. English adventurers made several unsuccessful attempts to plant colonies in North America. Sir Humphrey Gilbert tried in 1578 and again in 1583, but failed in both efforts. In the second of these ventures, Gilbert's ship was caught in a storm at sea and all aboard were drowned. In 1585, Gilbert's half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, sent an expedition to establish a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. The settlers faced many problems, however, and soon abandoned the colony. In 1587, Raleigh sent another expedition led by John White. The party of more than 100 settlers landed at Roanoke in July. A month later, White's daughter gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child to be born in America. White soon sailed back to England for supplies. When he arrived at home, he found his nation preoccupied with the threat of the Spanish Armada. When he finally returned to Roanoke in 1591, he found that the entire colony had vanished. The only clue to its fate was the word Croatoan carved on a tree, apparently a reference to a nearby island and its Indian inhabitants. To this day, the disappearance of the lost colony of Roanoke remains a mystery. Continued interest in colonization. Early failures at colonizing North America did not discourage the English. Adventurous businessmen still hoped to make profits in the New World, either through the discovery of gold and other precious metals or through trade and fishing. Many Englishmen saw opportunities to settle in the New World and make new lives for themselves in America. The joint stock companies. The experiences of Sir Walter Raleigh and others had shown that it would take a great deal of money to found a successful colony in the North American wilderness. Thus, groups of English businessmen began to organize joint stock companies. In the Joint Stock Company, a forerunner of the modern corporation, several businessmen invested in a single company to support a colonizing venture. If the colony failed, each man would lose only what he had invested. If the colony succeeded, profits would be divided among the stockholders. The Virginia Charter. In 1606, King James I granted a charter allowing 2 joint stock companies to undertake colonization in Virginia, a long and indefinite section of North America's Atlantic coast. The company centered in London. The London Company was to settle southern Virginia, and the company located in Plymouth, the Plymouth Company, was to settle northern Virginia. The charter outlined the way in which the colonies should be governed and guaranteed that the colonists were to enjoy the same rights and liberties as Englishmen abiding in the home country. Over the years, this guarantee was extended to other colonies until it became a foundation stone of American liberty. Years later, when the King and Parliament tried to tighten their control over the colonies in the 1760s, the colonists would insist upon maintaining their freedoms. The Virginia Colony. With the agreement that the settlers were to share their profits with the stockholders for 7 years, the London Company prepared an expedition of over 100 settlers, all men and boys, to plant a colony in Virginia. In April 1607, a fleet of 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed into Chesapeake Bay. The settlers sailed up a river they named the James and, in May, established a settlement they called Jamestown. Both the river and the settlement were named in honor of James I. Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in the New World. The site chosen for the settlement seemed easy to defend against Indian attack or invasion by the Spaniards, who hoped to drive these Protestant intruders from the New World. But the Jamestown settlement had several problems. 1, the low-lying land was malaria-infested. 2, the river water was contaminated. And 3, hostile Indians troubled the colony. Finally, 4, most of the settlers were either too lazy to work or too proud to do common labor. By the end of the first winter, half of the settlers had died. Jamestown's biggest problem was the common store system, established by its charter. Each man was required to place the fruit of his labor in a common storehouse, and each was entitled to receive food and supplies from the storehouse according to his need. This communal, belonging to the community system meant in reality that the industrious man must provide for the idle. Many yielded to their sinful nature and spent their days in idleness or searching for gold. With everyone benefiting from the common storehouse but few contributing to it, the food supply was quickly depleted. Thus, America's first experiment with a form of socialism failed miserably. In 1608, Captain John Smith took charge of the colony and saved it from self-destruction by ruling with a firm hand. He established the policy that any who would not work should not eat. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. As historian David Montgomery put it, those who tried to live without working soon found that they must also try that harder thing, to live without eating. When an injury forced Captain Smith to return to England, Jamestown again teetered on the brink of failure. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, called the Starving Time, the hungry settlers were forced to eat dogs, horses, even rats and mice. Although several hundred more colonists had come to Jamestown since 1607, only 60 remained alive by the spring of 1610. With the coming of spring, the surviving settlers prepared to abandon the colony and return to England. But, just as they were departing, several ships arrived from England with supplies and more settlers. The colonists then decided to stay. Jamestown begins to prosper. The introduction of tobacco. Life in Virginia slowly but surely began to improve. As new settlers continued to arrive, the colony began to grow. Some of the new settlers were farmers, and some were skilled craftsmen. Eventually, new settlements arose outside Jamestown. One of the most famous Virginia settlers was John Rolfe, who married the Indian princess Pocahontas. Rolfe introduced the Virginia colonists to the growing of tobacco, a crop the American Indians had long used. Virginians were soon exporting large quantities of tobacco to Europe. King James I opposed the use of tobacco and even wrote a pamphlet against it. Nevertheless, Virginians produced the crop in abundance. At one time, tobacco was even grown in the streets of Jamestown. It would eventually become a profitable export crop for Virginia and other southern colonies. The abundant tobacco crop created the need for a large labor force. At first, indentured servants met this need. An indentured servant was one who entered into an agreement by which he had his passage to America paid by an established colonist. In return, the servant was obligated to work for his benefactor without pay for an agreed-upon period of time, usually 4 to 7 years. Having fulfilled his contract, the servant became a free man. Many poor people came to the American colonies as indentured servants and, after working off their obligations, became successful and prosperous colonists. A new labor supply. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived from Africa with a cargo of about 30 black servants to be sold to the settlers. These first Africans in Virginia were purchased as indentured servants rather than slaves. This led to the beginning of the slave trade in British North America. In increasing numbers, blacks captured on the west coast of Africa were transported by whites to the colonies to be sold into slavery. Although many in both England and America raised their voices against slavery, British merchants also became involved in the slave trade. By the 18th century, even New Englanders were engaged in this cruel but profitable business. Important changes. The leaders of Jamestown greatly improved living conditions when they abandoned the common store system and gave each man his own plot of ground where he could produce his own food. If he did not produce, he would risk going hungry. In essence, Jamestown adopted a system of free enterprise or capitalism. Free enterprise means that government leaves individuals free to own businesses and make a living dependent on their own enterprise or initiative. The free enterprise system provided the incentive necessary for the production of sufficient crops for the colony. Free enterprise would become a cornerstone of America's greatness. More stability came to Virginia in 1619 when the first women arrived to marry the settlers. With the establishment of homes and families, more settlers would stay in the colony permanently. This wilderness outpost would become home for many colonists. The House of Burgesses. As the colonies were founded, they would set many important precedents or happenings that serve as examples to be followed in the future. which helped shape our nation as a strong democratic republic. One important precedent was set by early events in Virginia. In 1619, the people of the various districts of Virginia sent delegates called burgesses to a representative assembly in Jamestown called the House of Burgesses. This assembly advised the governor of the colony and assisted him in making laws. The House of Burgesses set an important precedent for representative government in early America. Virginia becomes a royal colony. In 1624, the king revoked the charter of the London Company, and Virginia became a royal colony, or a colony owned by the king and administered by his royal governor. However, the laws continued to be made by representatives of the people. Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Indian uprisings threatened the western settlements of the English colonies. Virginia's frontier settlers appealed to Governor Berkeley for protection, but he did not respond. Some accused him of caring more for his prosperous fur trade with the Indians than for the welfare of frontier settlements. Nathaniel Bacon offered to lead a volunteer militia against the Indians, insisting that frontiersmen were entitled to the same protection as established colonists in Jamestown. But Berkeley rejected the offer. Already disgruntled over what they considered to be unfair taxes, the frontiersmen followed Bacon and pursued the Indians against the governor's wishes. When Berkeley accused Bacon and his men of rebellion, the frontiersmen marched to Jamestown and burned it, forcing Berkeley to flee. Bacon soon died, however, and Governor Berkeley regained power. Bacon's rebellion was an early indication that Americans expected their government to protect all citizens.